Okay, hello everyone, welcome. So Tim Neate come staggering distance from King's College, which apparently is only a 20-minute walk up the dizzying road. So it's really great. This is a good close visit. So really looking forward to your talk on total communication technologies. And communication on computers is very important. I also took, we've got people across, because we're part of psychology here over in psychology and language sciences, and I thought it really would appeal. So I've seen a few of our colleagues from there on the Zoom call as well. So that'll be really nice. But anyway, I'll stop talking and let you
cool.
carry on.
Thank you, Duncan. Hello, I'm Tim. I'm based in the Human-Centered Computing Group at King's, and I do mostly human-computer interaction and also accessibility work and everything around that sort of area. My work mostly fits in three areas. So support to access digital content, so things like television, radio, online digital content from an accessibility point of view. So that's both creation and consumption. And also I sort of more recently have begun working in digital health data, so how people can interact with their own digital health data, again with an accessibility angle. So how do you support access to very complex data? I won't be talking about any of that today. I'll be talking about something else today. So today I'm going to be talking about some recent research we've been doing the last 2 years or so, and this is all focused around how we can augment human communication for people who have communication impairments. And this talk is called Total Communication Technologies. It's kind of a holding title that I'm working with at the moment. And the general idea is I want to think about technologies which support or augment non-direct forms of human interaction. And what does that mean? I guess we'll get into it now. So when we communicate, we do so much more than listen. We might complement speaking and listening with forms of communication like body language. We might fold our arms, and this might be done performatively to suggest, a questioning nature. We might point at things, so we might use our fingers, or we might use a laser pointer to point things out and make things in our environment clear and provide some context for a conversation. We might put our arms in the air to suggest some kind of astonishment, or we may use a fist to show accomplishment or aggression. And we use our environment, so we can use objects or props. So you might use your water to suggest some object of tangibility in the environment. We might sketch on papers. We might use proxemics. So we might position ourselves in such a way that we can communicate things more effectively. So I might sit at directly opposite you if I'm interviewing you for a job, because it's like provides an air of kind of confrontation or like difference. I might sit on the same side of a table as you to support you if we're working together on something. And lots of clinicians would sit at 90 degrees to somebody to suggest perhaps a mixture of the both. And clinicians often are trained to sit at 90 degrees to people. Okay, so we also use verbal cues like inflection, tone of voice, subconscious information, so breathing patterns, various complex things like gaze and the clothes we wear, all these things. So we're familiar with all of these things. All these cues are vital. Some are intentional and some of them aren't. And this broader form of communication is used by everyone, but it's particularly important for people with communication impairments. So if you lose some aspect of language, then you might compensate for your loss of language with other cues. So total communication is often trained in people with communication impairments to support more effective communication, to make up for challenges with language. So this is something that might be trained in somebody who's lost language, and they may be supported with things like gesture and similar. So 14 million people in the UK at some point will have a communication impairment during their lives. And so that might be two or three children in each classroom. It might be 2/3 of stroke survivors, or 1/3 which will have some kind of lasting communication impairment. So in our work, we focus mostly on people with aphasia, which is a relatively common communication impairment, yet somewhat underreported and misunderstood. Despite it affecting a substantial number of stroke survivors, few actually know the details beyond the fact that someone might have trouble with speaking after a stroke. It's quite complicated. People with aphasia have varying challenges with language, and it might mean listening, reading, speaking, or writing, or any combination of these. And aphasia affects everyone differently. So it doesn't affect intellect, but might affect somebody's listening, reading, speaking, or writing, or some combination. And it's a bit of a crude analogy, but many people with aphasia use it, so I'll use it. It's like going to a foreign country where you can't speak or read the language, but understand everything else. So to summarize, total communication, like gesturing, using our body language, is vital for people with communication impairments, yet technologies don't really consider this so much at the moment. So things like video conferencing do not fully encompass diverse needs, nor do the technologies used to augment or support communication. So in this talk, I'm going to give an overview of some work we've been doing recently into understanding how we might support and augment communication with tech. So I'll discuss how through 3 projects, one looking into video conferencing, one looking into augmentative alternative communication, and one looking into discrete augmentative alternative communication, AAC. I'll get into these terms a bit later on, and then conclude with some ongoing projects. And there's going to be a plug at the end, so be prepared for a plug, a shameless plug. Okay, so this is some work published, I think, last year, and it explores the impact of video conferencing on communication, specifically for people with the language impairment aphasia. And this was done with some colleagues at City University of London and also at King's. So video conferencing became very important during the pandemic, right? So we wanted to understand the impact of video conferencing on communication, specifically focusing on total communication. And we know from the literature there are challenges with latency, background noise, lack of eye contact. And it's evident that also we lose communication styles like proxemics. So I'm unable to position myself in a room to suggest more nuanced communication methods, for example. And we're interested in how this affects communication for people who have trouble communicating, people with aphasia specifically. And then we were interested in what these challenges were and how we might design future platforms better, therefore. To the pandemic's isolation policies meant that we had to switch to video conferencing. And this was also true for many groups who do therapy. So we moved all of our therapy services online, many in the UK, and many often also didn't. So many charities essentially went under or stopped offering services. And this was a varying success. And we worked with a successful group. So we conducted this 3-part study at a specialist aphasia charity called Discover, based in the Southeast, and so in Leatherhead. And Discover moved all their communication support online during the pandemic. So after some experimentation, so they tried lots of different platforms, they chose Zoom as the platform that was best for them. And they were generally quite successful. And now they offer online provision as just a part of their service. We aim to understand the members of aphasia's experience of video conferencing. So we did this through naturalistic observations. So we sat in lots of sessions, we recorded lots of sessions. And this involved 46 people, 34 with aphasia, 12 charity staff, and we conducted interviews with a subset of these people also. So we recorded 15 sessions at the center. So this is over 10 hours of footage. 2 coders iteratively coded in vivo and looked at instances of communication, essentially. So challenges and total communication use. So this is how the analysis looked. There's more on this in the paper, but I thought it was interesting to perhaps show like how this practically looked. So it involved lots of coding in the actual video. So it's not particularly useful to code transcripts because of the amount of communication we wanted to observe. Transcripts are essentially meaningless. We also transcribed, obviously, via in vivo, directly off the video, and then we coded it, and then we did further analysis and export and discussions in vivo and Miro. Then we conducted some interviews to frame this data. So we wanted to understand perhaps what the observations actually were. So we interviewed charity staff, so they looked like this. They began broad, and then focused into specific details relating to total communication and communication more broadly. And then we interviewed people with aphasia. So we did some accessible interviews using visual aids like slides, and a speech and language therapist conducted these. And 1 or 2 people had support from a family member. And again, the analysis was very similar here. So we coded onto transcripts. So now I'm going to go through some kind of high level, I guess, key results and observations, and provide some video examples. Hopefully, you should be able to hear these. If you can't hear them, let me know, or if you have any challenges with them. So similar to real life communication, a common strategy for supporting communication was props. So like I'm using this laser pointer. So things in people's environments or bits of paper with writing on them were used to support speech. So the speech of others and also in response to questions. So unique observations were that props were sometimes used to support others. So the charity staff was supporting other people's language with the props. So here's a video example of a video of a charity staff member in the top right, reinforcing the speech of one of the members with aphasia in the top left. So the gentleman in the orange shirt in the top left there. And she does this by providing an additional modality, i.e. writing, to support the other members in the group with comprehension. So this is like an explicit behavior that the therapists are employing.
In the 70s. Okay, so very much your sort of childhood. So in the 1970s, the electric trains began more.
So highly novel behavior, and one which emerged only when the charity moved online, was these very strange, bespoke, custom-made props. So these were handmade, sometimes by the charity, sent in the mail to the members with aphasia, and sometimes also made at home. And these were used in lieu of Zoom's reactions, and particularly supported those with limited speech. So basically, people couldn't use the interface for Zoom, and therefore they made props to react. So the following video example shows the discussion around these, with some members of the charity staff waving them to camera.
I'm not sure if you take your yeses and your no's when you go out. Has anybody done that?
No. I'm too busy dreaming about mine to take them.
So now turning to gestures. Gestures too were common, as with props. These were held up to the camera, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. For example, sometimes these were held up out of the frame of the camera. So this shows a member with aphasia with limited speech responding successfully via a gesture to the charity staff to confirm a response. And he also uses some additional sound effects. And this is a person who has extremely limited speech, yet still communicates really well. And you can see how he's framing his gesture in the camera. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, in the bottom left.
Did he go to another country?
We uncovered lots of challenges also. So video conferences introduces lots of these like small challenges to communication. And we're going to provide some common examples. But there's much more detail in the paper about how this worked. So as mentioned earlier, framing of props and gesture were a challenge. In a shared environment, normally you can see somebody's whole body. So like gestures and props can often be successful. However, on video conference, you kind of have to monitor your camera to properly frame any props or gestures. And this doesn't always work, especially for users with iPads who don't have their own video stream, video feed coming back to them, as is common on many video conferencing platforms which utilize smaller screens. So for example, this video shows the member with aphasia in the bottom left showing a bespoke prop to one of these weird stick things that they invented to answer a question, but it's out of frame, so you actually can't see it, right? So bottom left.
Now that you've noticed them, yeah, same with you stuff. Yeah. Right.
And you can see here on the right, I'll show this video a bit later, but this lady in the bottom right is actually monitoring her own video feed as she's holding this up to the camera. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. So latency and audio processing were known challenges for video conference. These things we already knew, and these introduced additional communication challenges on top of the currently existing communication challenges that people had. So in this video, we're going to see a member with aphasia quickly answer the question. So he's able to answer the question really quickly. It's kind of a bit of trivia. So he's really kind of, I guess, happy that he's able to answer the question, but nobody hears him because essentially somebody else speaks and the audio cuts it off completely. So one of the other members So the chap number 3, position number 3, his speech comes through because I guess he's louder. And so his answer isn't really heard. So this gentleman's very smug about knowing the answer, but nobody hears him until later on when he's able to correct.
That's Harrison Ford. He's a famous actor. What films was he famous for? Do you know?
I'm sorry, the faintest idea.
Indiana Jones.
So we're now going to contextualize some of this data with the sets of interviews, focusing on the challenges people had with video conferencing, and then talking about the benefits. These are kind of both sets of interviews kind of merged into one. So many felt that the drop in communication bandwidth enforced some kind of structure into the sessions. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Zoom/Teams, whatever platform you use, generally makes communication more structured and turn-based. So one charity member noted that in person, you feel like you're much more able to adapt and change something in the session or do something different. Whereas on Zoom, you're like, okay, we're going to talk about the sport. That's all I've got here today, and my brain can't handle anything else. This introduced ambiguity and loss of communication. So for example, one staff member said, I think I know probably because I'm a speech therapist, but recognizing when somebody has something to say in a conversation and moves forward and responding to the body actions, implying that this doesn't really work in video conferencing. And this therefore made turn-taking a challenge, with many not knowing when to speak or speaking over each other, as we saw earlier in the Indiana Jones example. One member with aphasia with milder difficulties with speaking noted that you have to hold back for other people to have a turn. And it's not as easy as conversation face-to-face. You aren't aware of other people online wanting to speak so much, essentially. And members with aphasia felt this additional pressure. So on Zoom, or Teams, whatever, but on Zoom in this case, when you speak to everyone. Whereas here I might go and speak to somebody in another side of the room and not everybody else would hear, right? So we're able to like partition our conversations better in real person, in the physical center. So the issue really here is that people with more severe aphasia who take longer to speak essentially are then therefore cognizant of the time they're taking up of other people's engagements. So they feel almost a burden in this online environment. And these more formalized sessions and the fact that you, when you speak to everyone on video conference made socializing a challenge. And as the volunteer at the charity noted, you're just not together. When you're in person, you're sharing food, even a coffee break. It's quite an important social phenomenon. And I guess I've learned more about the individuals in the coffee breaks than in the formal parts of the sessions. So in general, personal and informal communication is challenging on video conference. And these are vital parts of the charity's work, and therefore, this is a major issue for them in the online sessions. Members with aphasia also noted how they were unable to have autonomy about who they were able to go up to. So like I was saying just now, you can't go up to, in the physical charity center, you can go up to people and have a weekly chat with them about whatever it is you're doing that week. However, on Zoom, autonomy is removed and the breakout rooms are essentially controlled by the host or by people who know how to use the technology. And then the process is therefore formalized and sort of, I guess, medicalized in some way. So as a member of aphasia, a member with aphasia puts it, to say, discover me and the member of staff, go away and have a little chat. Essentially, you can go up to somebody and chat to them. And in addition, at the physical center, members don't come along with their family. Whereas when you're doing it over Zoom, your family are there. And the SLTs argued that it was empowering for the people when they have in-person sessions because their family aren't there. But when you're on Zoom, your relatives will be hanging over and wanting to support you with the speech, when in reality, that probably might not be the best thing for you. So one benefit of video conferencing was being in your home, and you can present and communicate through your environment. So for one example, the charity staff member noted how this empowered the members with aphasia. So I'm not the person with aphasia, I'm actually the person with the garden that looks like this and the kitchen that looks like this. So this also afforded personal prop grabbing. So members with aphasia were able to exhibit achievements like medals or show surprising things about themselves. So, so for example, some people were showing medals, model train collections, you name it. The members with aphasia and the charity staff noted that video conference is a way to self-monitor. So this is the video I was talking about earlier. Don't worry, there's no sound. And you can see this in the bottom right. She's holding it up and sort of framing it. And clearly the visual reference that she's using in Zoom is supporting her in actually framing the iPad. So she's using her own image. So there. Then this sort of made the SLTs think about the way they communicate. So it makes them much more aware of their performance as an SLT, as a person. And you're much, as one of them said, you're much more aware of yourself on Zoom because you're looking at yourself. So if I'm writing words or doing a gesture, yeah, I'd be super aware of that. And this also, like from the analysis, indicated that they were kind of using it as a method of feedback. So people were, instead of just showing something like they would in the real session, they were thinking, I'm showing it in this way, could I show it in this different way? So they were doing some kind of reflective behavior using the webcam essentially. To summarize, some notable behaviors, which I've elaborated on more in the paper, were the exaggerated use of props for communication. For instance, the creation of these strange bespoke props, which people still use today when in the online sessions, which are almost performative tools to make up the lack of real-time feedback. And the subtle body language that we lose in video conference. And video conferencing introduced various challenges. I think one of the main challenges was framing, so how to frame yourself and how to frame gestures and body language and all these sorts of things. And the known challenges in the literature impacted people with aphasia disproportionately. So latency made conversation more stilted, resulting in this fact that people feel that they're a burden when they speak. The audio signal processing of speech, which is perhaps not attuned to diverse speech patterns, also were likely contributing factors. So in summary, video conferencing was very important during the pandemic, and this was a shift, has shown many who offer speech and language therapy that remote sessions are possible, but many people who've had a stroke are able to have therapy from their homes, which is a good thing. It's also, this is useful for people who are physically impaired or cannot leave their homes. Also in rural settings, so in London and the Southeast, East especially, therapy provision is substantially better than other parts of the country. Especially in rural areas, many places, people have had a stroke and have very little speech therapy support. So video conferencing presents an opportunity to widen the amount of people that we can get to. And it sounds kind of obvious, but if you do something over video conference, you don't travel. So you save a large amount of time not traveling out to these individuals. However, as the charity member puts it, people are just not together. The key in-person nuances of communication are somewhat lost over video conference. And these were particularly important for the members of this charity, and I'd imagine generally. So I'm now going to present a piece of work and switch slightly to think about more generally total communication in the real world and how we can augment communication with technology, and specifically how current technology aimed at supporting people in communicating works through a systematic review. And then I'm going to lead on from the systematic review into some more, I think, probably interesting meat of work, but I think this systematic review sets an interesting context for this piece of work that we did. So this is a systematic review context kind of summary type paper that highlights a very large set of augmented communication papers. So people with communication needs can use high-tech communication aids, so AAC, augmentative alternative communication devices, systems to compensate for communication difficulties that they might have. And they often look like the pictures on the, like this grid type thing here. Or we can think of Stephen Hawking, who uses a muscle, essentially, or twitch-based response. And while many use AAC effectively, the research has highlighted many challenges. So research has found that high-tech AAC can be frustrating to use, unreliable, slow, and ineffective for certain common communication interactions, leading to breakdowns and misalignments in communication. So we conducted a systematic review. What is the taxonomy and dominant characteristics of AAC generally at the moment? what research methods are people using to contribute towards AAC and their interventions, and how does high-tech AAC devices and interventions, who does it focus on? So who are using these devices? So we conducted a systematic review, and we believe that this exploration of the previous literature will hopefully map out a research space and improve future high-tech AAC design and identify uncharted research areas and improve our collective understanding of the field. So we ended up with 562 papers, whittling down to a pool of from 2000, standard Prisma method. I would go look at the paper because there's lots of boring details, basically standard Prisma method. And very briefly, I'll go over the results of what we found in terms of inputs and outputs. And then I'll get into the actual take-home messages, which I think are a bit more interesting, the high-level findings which are actually related to this talk. But I think this is still worth going into. So we find that the inputs of high-tech AAC have been more diversely explored than outputs. So you can see you've got mechanical, tactile. So for example, mechanical would be a button, tactile would be a capacitive tablet, camera, gestural, and camera inputs are becoming more common, but obviously this is a technological thing. It's relatively recent, maybe the last 10 or 15 years we've started using cameras for this type of purpose. And then audio and visual changes are basically the things that are, so like speaking aloud, the AAC, reading out some words, speech to text most commonly, and visual information just showing text. And you see how it's changed. This is not massively surprising, but you can see it started off with mechanical and then kind of diversified out. So lots of different input methods going on at the moment, increasingly tactile. So that would probably suggest things like iPads. We're seeing a shift towards iPads, and still some mechanical. Mechanical tend to be for people with more severe mobility challenges. And also there's some work on context, so location and various other like gestural type of inputs, and then outputs. Again, it's not really looking at a gustation or, but mostly visual audio, not surprising. So some high-level takeaways to think about AAC and communication more broadly. So one key thing we learned was that few papers consider participatory design. So out of almost 600 papers, so 562 papers on AAC, not many used co-design / participatory design, so 20. This is on the low side. This is actually lower than accessibility research in general. And it also tends to be a more recent trend. So this implies that few people with communication needs were engaged in the design of early AACs. So the entire conceptualization of AAC was mostly not designed with end users in mind, really, through necessarily deep participatory methods. So there may have been some consulting, but little participatory design. Now thinking about total communication, so a few papers considered the importance of non-direct pathways. So only 8 out of almost 600 papers. Most papers focused on simply word finding, word selection to communicate needs or intent. And there was little consideration for how these might support or augment total communication. So I would see this as a major shortcoming, given that many people who use AACs also rely on total communication. And finally, there was a very low focus on group settings. So most AACs for communication was between the person with the impairment and a therapist, or a person with the impairment and a loved one. Only 39 papers considered group settings. Only 11 papers considered communication between AAC users. So people who are using AACs would probably want to communicate, we assume, in these therapy settings, but this was actually barely considered in the literature. And there's more in the paper as well as the database we used to conduct the review, which we compare to the broader accessibility literature. So somebody did a very similar review, but on whole of accessibility, and we compare to this paper. Hopefully we should be launching a website soon where you'll be able to compare the various devices, and hopefully we should have a repository of all of the techniques and papers, and the database is available already. Okay, so based on the gaps highlighted in the systematic review, we wanted to explore this important possibility of supporting total communication through AAC. So this work was led by my PhD student, Humphrey, with input from undergrad students. And we wanted to understand how discrete form factors like wearables can augment communication. So abandonment of AAC has been linked to lots of different factors. And as we found in the systematic review, this can be due to the lack of ability to enable total communication as they block pathways, such as nonverbal language. So if somebody's using a tablet in their hands, then they cannot therefore gesture. And we see this as a potential challenge. And also the stigma of the devices. So if we have a big bulky device that's there explicitly to support you, it can be stigmatizing. So a big piece of computer hardware, for example. In the case of tablets, this is getting better because everybody has a tablet, and bespoke tablet apps have been very, very successful. Then also, we need to accept the fact that AAC can be strategically useful for setting conversational expectations. So if somebody's using AAC, this might suggest something about their conversation and the way the best to communicate with somebody who's using an AAC. So we're the first. This was the first like investigations. This is quite early work that I'll discuss in the next 5 or 10 minutes into how you can design visible and invisible AAC. So this is a chronology of the research. In terms of chronology, we used user-centered design cycles to develop 3 high-fidelity prototypes. These are called Prompt Me Out, My Speech OS, and the SST badge, with medical professionals who work with people with a range of communication and cognitive impairments, and also the deaf community. Following this, we held complementary focus groups with people with aphasia using divergent and convergent co-design methods. So essentially, we developed 3 prototypes with different communities, and then we used 2 focus groups to critique these prototypes, for example, here, and also envision future prototypes just from a very divergent thinking way. So the first prototype, Prompt Me Out, was devised for people who have challenges with public speaking. We worked with people with aphasia, and on command, the device will prompt a user with the very next word of some pre-prepared dialogue. So the system follows somebody's speech, and then when they get stuck on a particular word, when they're reading from a script, it provides us support. It's a very simple idea, and this was designed with some speech and language therapists. And generally, we were interested in thinking about how we could do this in a super discreet, subtle way. So it's done in the form factor of an earable. It works on Mac OS. It's just a Mac OS app, but it's a wearable form factor. So you just use an earpod. The next prototype was called My Speech OS, and this was designed with children with communication challenges in schools. It was designed with proxies, not with children themselves, but it was designed with teachers, essentially. And it's a smartwatch app that essentially supports the construction of sentences. So this is just more of a bog standard AAC device, but in a smartwatch form factor. And we wanted to explore how the smartwatch might enable people to construct sentences and text. That's just a basic watch app. The next is a badge, and this badge was ideated originally by the student, one of my undergrad students, and provides a live transcription of wearer's dialogue for loud environments, noisy environments. And it was designed in collaboration with deaf of hard of hearing community. So this student was born with hearing challenges, and he had envisioned this prototype for quite a long time. So he also then co-designed some of the aspects with the deaf community to think about font size and speed and things like this. So the envision context of things like face-to-face services, so we have bank tellers, shop, clerks, school. It's interesting to note that this is an AAC device, which is not worn by the person with a communication challenge. Oh, sorry. It's actually worn by the person who's in the public role. So this is a bank teller, for example. So onto these complementary focus groups. So we held 2 focus groups with people with aphasia. Both focus groups, we had 12 participants with aphasia with language difficulties ranging from mild to severe, and 5 had some kind of hemiplegia. And these were all supported by 3 speech and language therapists. And now we're going to focus on these divergent groups. So these kind of more out there, less concrete ideas. So this is before we actually show them these prototypes. So focus group 1 supported participants' discussion of regular communication challenges and the co-design of low-fidelity, discrete wearable prototypes. So we used video prompts to support creativity, facilitate communication, and promote ideation. we prompted 6 different contexts. So we showed video prompts of coffee shops, doctors, public transport, supermarkets, eating out, and being with friends and family. And these were derived from pre-existing ethnographic data of the lives of people with aphasia and conversational challenges. And then we used low fidelity prototyping to let participants devise solutions. Varying communication challenges, just using craft materials, bits of paper, pretty much anything we could find, mostly kind of craft materials and art kits. And now the convergence stage, we just took the prototypes to them basically. So we gave the prototypes to the participants. We explored them for 2 hours with people with various needs and various communication challenges and with various tech abilities. So some smartwatch wearers. And we essentially used these as a critiquing platform. So we wanted some data, and this was a useful way to have very tangible functional devices for people to look at, so that the language demands are relatively low for the actual ideation. So this is like an informal evaluation, if you will. So again, on to the results. So first theme considers psychological and contextual factors that constrain people with aphasia's communication. So this is thinking about these contexts and the challenges that people actually have in the day-to-day life. This initial sub-theme focuses on people with aphasia's social context and subsequent difficulties that arise from having an often an invisible disability. So for example, in the following video, Rick, who has no bodily paralysis, describes, also his name isn't Rick, that's Rick with air quotes. He describes the difficulty of communicating and asking for a seat on public transport with strangers who are aware of his underlying disability.
Not even knowing that physically I don't know. They don't they just like
A secondary subtheme focuses on negative emotions and traumatic communication experiences for people with aphasia. So for example, Grace in the following video describes the challenge of communicating with aphasia when there's extreme social pressure from an impatient queue behind them at a coffee shop. And then theme 2 focuses on these positive and positive emotions and externally visible support. So these are the things that help. So in particular, the first subtheme notes the positive emotions, habits, and routines. So that improve access, forge independence for people with aphasia. So as Grace explains in the following video, she has a routine for ordering coffee, and it means that her mind doesn't blank when she's expected to produce dialogue. So she has a very specific routine of warming up to get ready with her sentence for what she wants in her order.
But it has to and now I can always say no.
So after discussing the various communication problems arising from living with aphasia and going out and doing typical communication activities, we kind of got this co-design process going, an ideation process, or a divergent thinking process. And in total, we built 7 AAC prototypes with varying form factors. So 2 mobile phone apps, 3 smartwatch apps, 1 pendant device, and 1 wearable badge. Devices all had different body placements and public visibilities. So one notable design included a wearable AAC badge, which participants envisaged to be highly visible to display key information to strangers. So this information might be, I have a disability, I have aphasia, I've had a stroke. Yet when turned off, the badge could blend into the color of the user's clothing, so altering its visibility, becoming more discreet and unobtrusive. And participants also proposed other display options using, including the wearer's destination, so showing where they're going so that they can get support if they're lost, and also just their favorite football team or badge. So basically it just becomes a normal badge blending into the environment. Below the low fidelity designs, participants equally had meaningful critiques of the high fidelity prototypes. So Prompt Me Out, so the earable device, was considered useful for public engagements, yet participants stressed the importance of the device performance due to its discreteness as an earable, i.e. it has to work and it has to work immediately, because otherwise it would be challenging to understand what's gone wrong in the communication between the individual speaking, because it's so discrete. The STT badge was considered useful in noisy environments and group conversations, and suggestions for improvement included providing a touchscreen. So essentially participants wanted to be able to see what had happened before. So what had happened before in the communication between them and, say, a bank teller. And the MySpeech OS, so this is the watch app, was also positively viewed, especially by people who already had smartwatches. So there's actually very few smartwatch AACs. There's one that we know of, and there may be more. Participants critiqued the UI, which was too small, and features, there was too much information on each view, which I think was sort of expected. There's more on this in the paper, we can, but we're being a little bit brief here. So what does this mean for invisible AAC and AAC which can change its visibility? So users should have the autonomy to control the visibility of assistive tech, depending on the needs and the settings and the communication partners. And highly visible AAC can be strategically useful in specific circumstances. And also participants, when they co-designed these devices, they wanted devices which could also blend into clothing. So be a pendant or be something that's perhaps an aspirational device like a pendant or a smartwatch. So I'm now going to speed through some current ongoing work, and one of the bits of work builds upon this idea of visibility in AAC. And I do this with a general view of seeing if any of this work is of interest to collaborate and things like that. So I currently have a PhD student who's extending the video conferencing work that I discussed earlier, and she's thinking about how we can support nonverbal communication, specifically thinking about educational settings for large numbers of people who are communicating. So it might be a large class of students, for example. We're currently exploring various potential approaches for doing communication across remote settings. So we're inspired by work like Inform and various other kind of tangible prototypes. And we're thinking about how we might support these things like physical props, physical interactions with objects in remote settings to support these tangible interactions. So we've been exploring some mid-air haptic gestural guidance, so how you can essentially guide another person in mid-air and perhaps support them in communicating a specific gesture, but in a remote setting, so without any physical contact. And we have a paper on this coming out soon. It's tangentially related, but it's a wider part of the general vision of total communication tech. And we're currently finalizing 2 smartwatch AAC apps, which have come out of the previous work that we did in terms of the inspiration. And we've done lots of co-design work to develop these apps, and they are nearly shippable. One of these apps supports inward communication, so the recall of words or facts or prior conversations on a discrete form factor that I could just glance at on my wrist. And the other method is kind of the opposite, where we promote outward communication, so to show others key messages. So for example, if we have trouble communicating, I could very easily be able to show somebody my wrist and communicate that I've had a stroke, or I have trouble hearing, or that I'd like a seat on the tube or something like this. So the image above shows someone getting information from the watch in the top left. So that's a user gaining information from the watch, looking up a piece of information from our study. There's relatively new work, so I won't go into too many details, but he's essentially gaining information from the watch, so some kind of keyword that he needed to learn about. And then in the bottom left, he's showing his communication partner some key information on his watch. And this is supporting communication in a kind of discrete wearable form factor. We're also thinking about, inspired by things like the sunflower lanyards, we're thinking about how badges can be employed, and also from the work on one of our participants in the previous study on pendants. So we've been building lots of different form factors of badge, and we're looking at how these could be used to support communication. So specifically e-ink badges and various other low power form factors. And so I'm going to end with a quick conclusion. Thank you, and a plug, shameless plug that I mentioned earlier. So limited work considers total communication, despite its obvious importance for people who have communication challenges. But we argue for a more expansionist notion of what communication can be when it's mediated by technology. And rather than thinking about it as a discrete information communication between individuals, think of it as an ongoing set of signals which might support or augment communication and may or may not involve technology. And we hope to continue this work over the coming years and welcome any ideas that you have. And big thanks to the people who actually did most work here, the collaborators below. Discover and Aphasia Reconnect, who are our charity partners, and to you for listening, and shameless plug. So I'm hiring, finally, shameless plug, I'm hiring a postdoc to begin in August, September, on a very exciting project about making accessibility interventions for digital content. So thinking beyond subtitles and audio description, imagining how we might render digital content dynamically to any user with the aim of making it more accessible. So you could be working with my collaborators at the BBC, these two amazing charities I mentioned, lots of speech and language therapists, and various other university academic partners. We have a very strong PhD student in place already, and lots of good undergrad and master's project students coming through every year. We've got lots of funding for travel and equipment and a super supportive environment. And chat to me if you're interested. And that's my talk.
Thank you so much. As ever, we've got a lot of people online. So if you have a question, hit the beacon from me here. Any questions?
Thanks so much for the talk. It's really interesting. I wanted to ask quickly about the co-design work, and I liked how you chose to do a kind of divergent and then convergent process. Which was harder?
I think I find divergent easier because I enjoy it more, because people are coming up with lots of different ideas. I find convergent a little bit hard because we've already, so in the particular case that I described here, we already had these prototypes, and people obviously don't necessarily want to critique things that have been built and look complicated. So I find it really hard to be able to say, look at this beautiful thing I built, and then, you know, please rip it to shreds or whatever it is. And so I find that bit hard. I don't think we do that very well as a community, this like critiquing kind of convergent like thing. So that's the hardest bit, I think.
I'll jump in with I've got a question here from Mina over the road. She's joined online. She says, hi, Tim, I enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I'd be interested in learning more about the role of the whole body in communication with persons with aphasia. You mentioned briefly how participants experience Zoom as limiting their communication. It allows us to only attend to the upper body of that person. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how your participants describe the importance of being able to see the whole body of a person during a dialogue, Zoom or otherwise. If this is important, what role do you think seeing the whole body might play in future design? Is that all clear?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's a nice question. I think the whole body is really important. I think that things like not necessarily what you're doing with your legs, but the way that your body is placed to another person is really important. So proxemics, I think, are really important to support communication. So where you sit, how you sit. And I don't know necessarily how, I'm sorry, I'm trying to imagine a full body Zoom, basically. And I don't know how that would.
You need ski goggles.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so I could imagine there's a really interesting bit of research to be done around around this, about how people communicate when you can see more and more, increasingly more of the person's like leg or arm or whatever it is. It's a good question.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. Very interesting. My name is Enrico Costanza. In the first project about aphasia, you mentioned that your participants couldn't use this sort of physical props that they received from the charity because they couldn't really, instead of using the Zoom reactions. Can you say a little bit more about why there is and how it compares, the physical versus Zoom reaction thing?
So sorry, was that why they found Zoom hard, or was that?
No, it's more specifically the Zoom reactions, because like they had this signs and sticks. They were like yes, no, and whatever else.
So yeah, they found that using the Zoom reactions hard, and I think there's two reasons why that was. I think firstly, people found the menus fiddly to be able to very quickly go yes and no, and this is partially because they were using mostly iPads and tablet computers. One other issue was simply the fact that because they were using tablets and different configurations of Zoom, so we had some laptops, we had some tablets, we had some even smartphones. I think the issue was that the advice that you would give to somebody would always be different. So to access, say, this in the iPad version, you need to do a completely separate set of steps as to the desktop version, basically. So that was the challenge in, firstly, the speech and language therapist debugging it, and also some people just having challenges remembering all the various steps.
Thanks.
You have to press something.
Hi, it was very powerful to see the videos as examples of what you were trying to demonstrate. This is a meta question, could you comment a bit on the ethical process and considerations of being able to show the people in the videos without blurring them or using some kind of other kind of anonymization?
So we don't, we do have some, so we have quite a complicated consent procedure. We have, I think, 3 conditions for, basically, I want to be in the videos. Some people really want to be in the videos because they want to be attributed. So they want their ideas to be clearly from them and shown in the papers. Some people want to be blurred because they don't want to have their faces shown for obvious reasons. And then some people who don't. So we've only shown people who are in category 1 here. How informed consent works is essentially a speech and language therapist. There's a bit of a pre-procedure where they'll essentially give them the form and they'll describe what's going to be happening, and then they'll do the consent maybe 2 weeks later, and they will essentially either use prior footage that we have of what it looks like, and if that doesn't exist, they'll explain it in quite a lot of detail, and we'll then say we'll then show essentially like what we're going to be doing with the data. It's always done by a speech and language therapist because if there's any questions or ambiguity in how the in what they're going to be doing, they're able to kind of get really into they're able to sense if there's a challenge, and they're all kind of trained in doing informed consent with people with aphasia. So essentially the answer is we don't do it. We get other people to do it for us, and we consent people with a trained speech and language therapist.
Very good. I think probably a good time to say thank you very much.
Super.
Forward.